Alrighty, welcome. Today we have T. Wilson. She has worked with me as both a colleague and as one of my employees. I've always been very impressed with her professionalism and her competence in all aspects that she's tackled of the software building process. And I will toss it over to you, T, to give a little bit more of an intro about yourself.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be a part of this. Yeah, I've had the opportunity, obviously, to work with you, Cam, over the years. I have kind of an eclectic background. When I was in college, I knew pretty quickly that school-based learning wasn't how I learned best, and I wanted to get on the job real quick. And I also knew I was coming up in the internet age, in the software age, and software was really attractive to me. So I took my first job straight out of school doing hardware installations, traveling around predominantly the East Coast of the US, installing software and then training, installing hardware and then training people on the software that they were going to use on those systems. And I did that for a couple of years. Traveling 3 out of 4 weeks a month is exhausting. So then I shifted to, well, how can I get more involved in being a part of building the software? And having had that experience of training people and taking that and bringing it back into, what the product actually is. And so from there, I moved into customer support, blended with a role of quality assurance. So often people might be calling in, seeking assistance, and through that you're often finding bugs and figuring out how to, work in that world. That naturally led me, and did that for a couple of years. That then kind of led me to the next step of wanting to be involved more in the business analysis side of things. Okay, so I've seen what it's like to install it. I've seen what it's like to train it. I've seen what it's like to try to support it and to test it. How can I even get more out in front of that in terms of the requirements gathering and the product design and being involved in that? Did that for a few years. And then that, with all that experience, the next many years of my career, each one of those things were kind of at different companies.
For that BA experience, can you give us a little bit of an example of what sort of cadence you were working on? How often were you writing requirements and how often were you shipping them? Like what sort of was your cadence in deployment there?
So it depends. A couple different ways. I've been involved in both, because in one, it was more in a government dominated industry, and in another, it was, I think, sort of more modern and smaller. And so I've done everything from the really long cycle times of lots of requirements gathering meetings and lots of heavy documentation and iteration after iteration of requirements, very waterfall kind of style.
And so, and units of time on long, because my mind jumps to one thing.
No, long could be months and months of just writing requirements and gathering requirements before you ever get to the build phase. I think maybe the shortest would be on an average of 5 months before we even started building from requirements.
So you could be talking years of lead time between idea and deployment into production.
Definitely, with lots of buy-in at many levels and iteration after iteration of feedback.
Okay, so that was the BA example you were talking about, and then you moved into QA through there, and then, so continue.
Sure. So after having done all of those roles for a handful of, 2-3 years each, the rest of my career really moved into more of a project management aspect of being in and around software development teams at various companies. Everything from team sizes as small as a couple of people to more mid-range. So I definitely have done the sort of 3 to 5 engineering teams, teams that are in the 10 to 15, 10 to 20 range. The largest team ever was probably in the range of 60 or so.
So 60, when you're saying like a team of 60, is that 60 engineers, or that's a multidisciplinary team, including designers and QA and product?
In the case of the near 60, it was strictly engineers, divided up between back end, front end, full stack, but definitely a large team of just engineers. So that wasn't even your analysts, your designers, and things like that.
So when you rounded it out with all those extra disciplines, what was the sort of fully loaded team size that you're talking about there?
If this will blow your mind like it blew mine, maybe 75, which goes to show you the range of sort of disconnect there between the people sort of doing some of the upfront work and the people that are putting their hands on to doing the coding.
Okay, and what was your role in that larger team?
In that one, it was project management. It was facilitating the requests that were coming from in and around the company and coordinating the release schedules and all of the meetings and when things are being done, and directly managing the work that was flowing in and out of the engineering team. So it wasn't the engineering manager, but worked very closely with the engineering manager.
Okay. Okay.
I've
And
also had experience scaling teams from in the 5 range to upwards of 25 range.
mhm. Over what sort of period of time? Was this like very short 6 month like sprints, or are these like, over a year, 2 years,
More
longer?
like company growth over a couple of years, gradually just increasing over time.
Okay. And you mentioned something about blowing your mind that it was 60 engineers and fully loaded with 75. Could you tell us a little bit more about the problem domain that you?
Sure.
It sounds like you had some beliefs also that like you would have done it differently if you were in control.
It's definitely true. It's definitely true. I mean, in particular, because in that scenario and in that environment, it tended to be a little bit more waterfall heavy, with a desire to move toward agile. And so I always jokingly, and I'm not the first person to coin this, but called it Wagile. It's a little combination of both.
I've heard it called like agile fall.
Exactly.
Like,
There's lots of blends. And so I think the challenge in that, their desire to move from waterfall to something more agile, not strictly agile, and the size of the engineering team and the limited size of the people that were available to do, product design and requirements gathering, and was that how do you answer the right number of questions to give an engineering team what they need to not quite do it in a waterfall way and not quite do it in an agile way and still get to where you need to get to on your timeline? And how do you measure it? It was really challenging. Mm-hmm. And I'd say sometimes it felt like we succeeded and other times it felt like we failed.
So in the times that it felt like it succeeded, what were there certain attributes of the types of work or the types of requests that seemed to work more, and the types of requests or types of requirements that didn't seem to work?
For me, and maybe it's part of how I think, or what I personally think is easier to measure, the things that you're doing that a person can get their hands on and interact with. So we're talking UI, front end, commercialized software, things that are out there on the internet for use. Those tend to be the things for me and my teams that are easier to measure, because you knew what lane you were trying to be in, you knew where your destination was headed, and you get a general sense of whether or not you ended up in the right town, right? When you're building something that's just back end, it can be harder to assess. Or if you're building something core infrastructure or core technology, that can be a little more challenging to assess. It relies very heavily on people with the technical expertise to assess that, which often isn't your managers or your program managers or your project managers or the people who are looking at the numbers to see whether or not the amount you spent is worth what you got. And those are the ones that I feel like have always been a little bit harder to measure.
So you're saying if the end customer was more like the people who were actually writing the checks in the organization, is that a good summary?
It's very true. Yeah.
It was easier to connect the value that was coming out of the engineering organization. Whereas if you were building a technical product, it was harder for the finance people, the people writing the checks, to understand if that API they built on some new database
Exactly.
that they were building.
Exactly.
Okay. And in this is like a full suite of different team sizes, which is fascinating, different experience. But what are ways that you've seen different organizations pick what to build, prioritize what to build, and maybe particularly like ways that seemed like pathologically bad, and other ways that seemed to succeed very well, whether it was generalizable across everybody, or just maybe for that team it seemed to work really well? Have you seen that? Give us some examples across that line of success and failure.
Yeah, I can certainly try. I think to step back to my experience and how it's been so blended, I have had the pros and cons of working in both professional services environments where you're building to what a client is lots of times dictating to you that they want, versus maybe working on something that for your company is internal and you're going to sell it and you have more control over what and how it is that you're building. And depending on which environment you're in, it's a very different approach to deciding what you're going to build. I far prefer those that are not professional services driven, where I'm not being dictated to and how to come about it. And so I've tried to center myself in not being in that situation as much as possible, because in that case, what you decide to build may not match what you actually think you should build. And you can make a recommendation to a client to go in a different route, but ultimately it's their dime, it's their spend, they're going to choose. In the other situation where you have more control, for me, it comes down to, when I'm leading a project team, it comes down to lots of conversation, lots of discussion. So leveraging the right people and as many people in your team who have experience and who don't have experience in what you're trying to do, because I think it's so important to hear multiple points of view, multiple ideas, different rounds of brainstorming, so that you're bringing in as much as you can, and then form a framework for how you're going to make the decisions on and decide what to build. I don't think it's, for me, I don't think it's textbook. I don't think there's one model or routine that I could follow and say I've done it the same way every time, other than to say conversation is, a key component to that.
So if I'm understanding right, it sounds like you're saying that in each case you had to use your judgment, but that also there wasn't necessarily a methodology or the same methodology that you were able to follow, and that at some level, if the engineering team say we really need to build this feature and it takes a week, and somebody from the business side was saying we really need this and it's going to take a week, trading those off was just sort of a gut call. There wasn't a framework, or there wasn't some sort of other way of measuring that and the value that was provided by those two features.
Yeah, I think that's in line with my personal experience has been, and one of the challenges I faced in the last 25 years of being, again, in and around software development teams is the different approaches that are out there, and they come and they go and they change and they evolve, and no one has been a perfect fit at any time. And so you kind of take what you're trying to achieve, who your audience is that you're trying to achieve it for, and look at the different models that are out there that you can use, and then use the best pieces from them to get where you need to go to decide what you're going to build.
And when you're doing that, you're part of the thing you're evaluating is the team that I'm working with, is the team that I'm tasking with work, are they doing a good job or are they not? Are we asking them to do hard things and they're doing the best they can, or are we asking them to do relatively easy things and they're just not doing it very well? So how have you seen organizations assess that sort of team success? Maybe not individual contributor, is this a good engineer or not, but just like this system, is the system performing well?
Right. I think before I even decide if it's performing well, I try to make sure that I've right-sized the process to the team, because no two projects are the same and very rarely have the exact same team. And so I start off by assessing both with myself and with the entire team, what is the skill set, what are people's experience and comfort level, and try to pick the right set of process and measurement at the start that's going to work for everybody. Because if folks aren't bought in, then you're also setting people up for not having a success, right?
Yeah, so let's dive in specifically on that measurement piece you said. So setting up process, setting up measurement, and right sizing it for the team. So could you walk through maybe a couple different steps as a team grows, either in maturity or size, of like what the different measures you would start to consider as that team evolved or grew?
Sure. In some cases, it has been as lightweight as getting engineers on board with doing their own unit testing before they throw things over the wall to QC, right? So let's say in this group, one of the core components of whether or not we're succeeding is determining the quality of the code, the defect rate at which we're introducing every time we bring new code into the system and ask a QC team to take a look at it. And then from there, it might also be taking the quality team and saying, hey, you've got really good intuition about what to test, but we really haven't done much by way of test cases or automated testing. Let's set a goal during this project that we're going to advance ourselves in that way and use that as a measurement for, there's developing that process, and each time you do, making it stronger and stronger with every project, because now you can leverage it each additional time.
So those metrics there would be like counts of bugs coming out of QC after some developer said that they was done. You would count the number of defects that were generated. Am I understanding correctly?
That's one component
That's
of it. The other component of it is counting that they actually, created, built, and performed the actual test. Even if you performed the test and you still introduced a defect, that to me was a sign of success, because we're still iterating on taking that next step of checking your own work, right?
Did
So
you have
yes,
automated tools? Did you have automated tools that you like to do that, or was that more of a manual process? What have
um,
you seen worked
early
well?
days manual, and I know toward the end more automated, but I wouldn't be able to remember the names of the tools, because one of the big ways that I like to run my teams is to let them choose the tools that work best for them.
But you're just saying, give me, so then these are like unit test coverage tools. You would just want to look at test
Right.
coverage, that sort of thing. Okay.
Right. That's
And
an
then on the QC side, you would look at either QA or QC. You would look at the same sort of coverage metrics of like what tests were automated and
right.
what tests did they. And would
Right.
you do that as far as a count or a coverage as well in that side?
In that case, we tended to turn more towards what made its way to production that shouldn't have. Let's learn from, um, by iterating every time we find something in production, how on earth did it make its way both through unit testing at a development level and through a quality control level, such that it still got out the door? What weren't we thinking about that we need to think about differently so that we catch it earlier next time?
hmm And I assume that those types of conversations easily lead into different tooling conversations or process conversations. Oh, I didn't know that he changed something over there that would have changed this other thing. And so some maybe training would also be on that list. But I could imagine that there's a broader range of tooling and process concerns that would come up.
Yeah, definitely. Also time. Time, let's not forget that time is a tool, right? So if you feel rushed, if you didn't have the time, if you were stressed because, as is often the case in the QC world, their time is compressed because maybe we took longer to build something than we anticipated. Well, I was rushed to test, therefore I didn't catch everything. And so with that comes process conversation about how do you address that going forward? And in my approach, it was often pairing up QC folks with engineers rather than treating them as islands that work on their own. We don't just develop something and toss it over to a different group and then respond to what they find, but let's have a dialogue and a proper handoff, and maybe go ahead and demo some of that code that you built and set the QC person up for, for being successful in a mindset before they even start touching your code.
Every software team I've ever been a part of, every project I've ever worked on, there
Okay.
has come a time where we've had an emotional conversation about technical debt. And I'm not sure we always were talking about the same thing or using the same words to describe the frustration, but the emotions were real.
Right.
So
Very true.
maybe to start with, how would you define technical debt?
That is a tough one. I think it comes in varied forms. I think sometimes the thing that feels most emotional with the folks that I've had the experience working with is what's bothering them, something they feel like they were rushed to do and they cut corners and they want to go back and do it what they feel is the right way, which often drives a conversation and a question around, well, are we doing just what's good enough? Are we doing what's perfect? And so there's a definition around technical debt, in terms of what you want to achieve versus what you need to achieve or what's good enough. And then I think there's sometimes where you've made choices because maybe of timeline pressures or budget pressures to do things in a different way that you would have done differently if you had that money or time. And so you say, this is technical debt we want to take on if ever we have that opportunity again to come back and revisit it. I think, I think that to me, that's been, at least in my experience, my main interaction with technical debt. It's a tough conversation because it's something that engineers feel very passionate about. And I think everyone who's not the engineer feels a little bit less passionate about it. So it's hard to latch onto it with it, but like you conceptually get it and you understand it because you can figure out in your own role, if you're not an engineer in the software development land, there's always something you want to come back and revisit. There's always something you feel you should have done differently or could do differently or needs to be done differently. And there's just a lot of different ways to classify that.
So I heard two definitions. I want to make sure that I'm understanding them correctly. So the first one is where maybe the person who's writing the checks has like a wider range of what is acceptable for the system to do or how it performs its task. And maybe the engineer is able in the time limits, the budgetary limits, to get one version inside of that possible set, but not as detailed as where that engineer thinks is best to build the system. So there's some gap there that the engineer may describe as technical debt, but other people in the organization might just say, well, it's good enough. It's fine as it is.
Definitely.
The other part of technical, or the other type of debt that I hear you describing is where there's a broader one, that there's an understanding before you even begin the project that due to limitations in budget or time, um, resources, knowledge, whatever, that there is a known path to take that would get a thing that everybody agrees that we want, but well, we can't afford a Porsche, so we're going to buy the used Civic instead. And we know that it's not going to drive as fast, and we're going to have to, it's going to break down more often, although maybe a Porsche is going to break down a lot too. But in this model, it breaks down more often. We're going to have to go to the garage more often to get it fixed, so that there's a gap in from our desires and our willingness to pay. There's a technical debt that's there.
Yeah, that's a great summary and much more eloquently said and with a good analogy. I think that's definitely true. And I think that latter example is the harder one to sometimes swallow for project teams, to start out on the foot of we're not doing quite what we know we could or should do, and we're going to do it differently. And those are often the ones that are harder to come back to and change.
Yeah, that coming back and the planning for the coming back, I think, leads us to a good place, which is in software. It seems like there's lots of sources of variability. Mm-hmm. So projections, future, forward-looking statements, future statements about when software is going to be delivered, and roadmaps, commitments to clients that go beyond 3, 6, 12 months. How have you seen companies deal with these longer term roadmaps in a good way, or in ways that didn't seem to lead to just internal strife and division and frustration and annoyance, or death marches of, well, we committed to the client, so just buckle mm-hmm. down and do it.
Right. My personal approach, when I have control over that conversation or input into that conversation is to say, don't end something unless you're sure that endpoint is something you can live with. Always, because things are always changing and the world is always evolving, and you're always going to be looking at doing something new, and there's more than likely always going to be more than you have the resources to do. And so if you end something, even if you think there's a phase 2 coming, you better make sure phase 1 is something you can live with and live with for a while, because what happens if phase 2 does not happen? And that's a question I like to ask at the onset of doing the requirements gathering and doing the roadmap planning, is to really say, do we need that extra month to get those extra 3 features in there in case we're stuck with this for the next 6 to 12 months? I don't know if that actually answers your question, but
that's fine. So then for, oftentimes with customers that maybe are not dictating, but are, strongly advocating for additional features or changes to the system, oftentimes the client facing or the salespeople want to put some statements about, oh, that's coming Q2 or Q4. Have you seen planning kind of in that longer term trajectory that's worked well, or does it seem like it's, you just way under promise and hope that you can squeeze it in by the target date?
Most of the time, it's say in the vast majority of my experience of what I've seen is 2 versions of plans. There's the internal version, which is what you really want and is aggressive and you probably won't achieve it all. And then there's the version you're willing to share externally that is much more conservative. Mm-hmm. I think that when you don't have an external version, you set yourself up for either having to produce something that is not what you want your core focus to be at that moment, or letting clients down. And I think it's great to have both versions of the plan. I've never worked in actually any company where there's been an ideal version of that. And
Mhm.
plans are always changing and because things are interconnected. So I've never seen a roadmap that stays, that is just static and doesn't, you can start something now and 2 years later that's exactly what you implemented. Things change. Life is full of change.
Yeah, absolutely. In the world of software, it seems like by the time you start to get halfway through, somebody invents something new that then you
Right.
have to reconsider your whole
That's right.
your
Oh, we'd known 6 months ago this was out there. We would have totally done it that way. Right.
yeah, some large company launches a product that either competes with you or totally changes your value proposition or something. Yeah. Um,
Absolutely.
what tooling are you excited about right now?
Tooling. This is a great question. I love when people ask this because I think my answer is somewhat non-traditional. It's nothing that you would use on a computer. It's at the human level, and it's conversation and listening. Every successful project that I've had, I can bring back to the roots of making sure from the start we were talking about what those requirements are. Mentioned this a little bit earlier, making sure we're leveraging every member of the team, sometimes outside the team, to gather as many inputs as we can to make sure we're making the right decisions. Sometimes that can get intense, sometimes it gets really fun, but what I find it does with teams is bring us to um, a place of consensus, so that even if your idea wasn't selected, you understand how we got to where we got and why we're going where we're going. And in all the projects where I feel like even if I haven't failed, if I feel like I've failed, I can usually bring it back to a lack of conversation and listening. So my favorite tool, my most important tool in any project, is leveraging humans, practicing the art of listening. A lot of what you've even done in this interview, which is a skill that not a lot of people are very good at. It takes a lot of practice, which is to really hear what someone's saying and reframe it in your own words and your own understanding, and ask for confirmation that what you've heard, you've interpreted correctly. And I think we don't, especially in requirements gathering, and when we're working with um, maybe creating some user personas or talking to clients or trying to get input directly from the people who are going to use it, is, are we really hearing what it is they're asking for? Or because we're software people, have we perceived something that we've already built in our mind that's super cool that did not at all hit the objective of what they were looking for, right?
Oh, I really want to build this thing for you. And since you said X, I'm going to just tell you that Y is the solution.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly.
So the tooling that you think everybody should use is better conversations. Are there particular conversational frameworks or you know
So many. There's so many out there. And I think
what's your favorite? What's the one you wish that if you could only have people read one book or watch one video on a particular one?
I don't know that I honestly don't. I can't say that it is it's not a particular process or something that is documented in a book, because and maybe it's the benefit of working in smaller teams, because that's where I tend to drive myself these days. It is, grab your favorite beverage, get around a table or sit in a circle or whatever it is, see each other, even in today's virtual world, see each other, start asking the questions, start with the unknowns, start with the knowns. It doesn't matter where we start, just start the conversation. It will naturally go where it needs to go, and recognize that that's not probably one session or two sessions, it's many sessions.
Mm-hmm.
And making sure that, I think there's a moderator. I usually play that role of moderator, making sure that, because there's always going to be people in a group that are more ready with ideas and excited to talk, and they're not shy. And then you can see the shy person over in the corner, and if you're paying attention, you can see their wheels spinning, and you can see that they've got something to say, but they're maybe not the person to interject. So in that role of moderator, I like to make sure that everybody's had time. Hey, I see you. Do you have an idea you want to share? And usually it's the quiet person in the room that steps up to the most brilliant thing, and everyone's like, oh, I didn't see that. So yeah, it's not a formal process for me. Not something I could specifically point to, except to say, as human beings, listen, learn, ask questions.
Interesting. I'm also hearing like a lot of trust and reliance on, faith in your fellow teammates, that people feel like they have a voice and that they're going to be listened to, and that their contribution is going to be honored and maybe not agreed with, and but that's okay. It's not a personal thing, and that the trust and strength of the team together.
Absolutely. Individuality within teams, the humans within my teams working together, it's all it's very central. It's a big part of how I've managed software projects over the years. Getting people to see things from different point of views, having a senior person maybe say, hey, but Joe sucks. Everything he produces is crap. Guess what? Joe's junior. Did you realize that Joe is, 2 years out of school, has no training in this and is learning how to do it? Did you think about sitting down and talking to him about what you'd specifically like him to do better? And then he does that, and next time Joe is the person you want on your project. Getting people to think, compassionately about each other, work together as teams, but also recognizing when someone in an individual role is doing great as an individual performer and that they're a strength in your team. Yeah, big part for me of software engineering.
What's something you feel like has been the most challenging or the most painful in the software process? Like, what is the thing that feels like you haven't been able to either consistently get it right, and it's always kind of difficult or painful, challenging, in a meaningful way?
Right. Probably measurement on all levels, because everybody's looking at a different measurement, especially when you're measuring success. Everybody has a different view of what that is. Whether it's the finance team or the product people or the end user or your direct manager or the team that you're working with, everybody's looking at it from a different perspective. And so when I try to measure quality or quantity or any other many metrics you could pick here, it's always hard to figure out which ones are the right ones and which ones should I be giving attention to, and not to cater just to who cares the most, but what are the right ones for this project. I wish there was a book I could just open up that would tell me exactly how to do it, and there has never been. I struggle with it. If you want to go solve that, that'd be awesome, Cam.
I'm open to solving that problem. Have you ever seen it work well? Have you ever felt like there was a glimmer or a hope, or maybe you got at least two teams to kind of agree on some metrics and it kind of changed the dynamics? Or any positive news in that answer?
Yes, but not one that I enjoyed. I think that I have had success in particular with financial measurement, figuring out, working with business stakeholders who are wanting to achieve something for a particular dollar, and how do we measure that we're going to get there successfully. That can tend to be the easier one, at least in my experience, to measure. You can find a way to put numbers on what you're producing. And once you find that mathematical formula, it's wash, rinse, and repeat. But that one's, in my personal opinion, the least interesting. It's important if you're keeping a business running financially, but in terms of software development and what we're tangibly producing, what you're putting out there in the world with this software, I don't think that answers a lot of questions. It tells me how much it cost to build it. It didn't answer whether it was useful. It didn't answer whether it solved the challenge that we were setting out to do. It didn't say whether or not people learned new skills from developing it, whatever your many other metrics might be. But yeah, so the one successful one has been on the financial side, but to me is also the least interesting one.
Interesting. And then you mentioned on those products that are closer to the consumer or more individual versus enterprise or back end. I'm surprised even on those that there isn't some sort of measures around units purchased or engagement metrics that are maybe not directly connected to revenue, but the organization understands them as proxy variables to, if we have users on our mobile app, if we have users on our website and they're coming back every day, they're going to be willing to pay for the subscription type of thing. You haven't seen those types of metrics? Or
well, it's a good point. I definitely have, and it didn't occur to me in the first round of answering your question. I definitely had. They're definitely out there. I think maybe in my personal experience, I've been more removed from them. I think sometimes once software leaves that engineering team, it goes out to other places. And while you wish you could always be involved in marketing and product and hearing what's coming in through customer feedback. Sometimes you're pretty far removed from it. That stuff channels its way back maybe in through roadmap building and product of what's coming back into the engineering team, but you're not, I think, as deeply connected with those metrics to know whether or not what you produced is really achieving it.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And as always, it's fun chatting and
Thanks for having me.
hearing more about your experience. I always check in and am amazed at the different things that you're doing. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Cam. I appreciate it. Great to talk with you.